You need to have that bridge removed by Friday. Vanessa Whitmore said it like she was reminding me to mow my lawn before the neighborhood picnic. Calm, pleasant, completely certain she was doing me a favor. For a second, I honestly thought I'd misunderstood her. I looked past her, expecting to find someone smiling or waiting for the punchline. Nobody was. 2 HOA pickup trucks sat in my driveway with their engines still running. Behind them, a flatbed trailer carried a yellow excavator that looked much too large for a quiet Tuesday morning. 3 contractors stood beside it drinking coffee, their hard hats tucked under their arms. They weren't talking much. They were just waiting. I followed Vanessa's gaze toward the river. My bridge stretched across the water exactly as it had every day for the past 15 years. Morning sunlight caught the steel guardrails, and a pair of swallows darted underneath before disappearing into the cottonwoods. If someone had asked me that morning what worried me most, I probably would have said the price of hay or whether we'd get enough rain before August. The bridge never would have crossed my mind. "I'm sorry," I said. "Which bridge are you talking about?" She smiled politely, almost amused. "Yours." She glanced at the clipboard tucked beneath her arm. "The board met last night. We voted unanimously to remove an unauthorized structure that's sitting on HOA property. You'll need to arrange demolition by Friday. If you don't, the association will remove it and bill you for the expense." She said every word with the confidence of someone reading tomorrow's weather forecast. No hesitation, no doubt, just certainty. My name is Daniel Harper, and my family has owned Harper Ranch for 3 generations. Long before Willow Creek Ridge became a subdivision full of matching mailboxes and HOA meetings, these hills belonged to cattle, fences, and people who measured time by the seasons instead of board calendars. The bridge Vanessa wanted gone wasn't something I'd thrown together over a long weekend. My father built it after a spring flood tore out the old crossing. He hired engineers, pulled permits, paid for inspections, then paid for extra inspections because, in his words, nobody ever got into trouble for checking twice. I used to laugh about that. Dad saved paperwork the way other people collected family photographs. Every permit, every survey, every receipt, every inspection report, everything disappeared into an old gray filing cabinet sitting in the corner of his workshop. As a kid, I thought he was a little obsessive. One rainy afternoon, I asked why he kept papers nobody would ever read again. He didn't even look up from labeling another folder. "Because paper doesn't forget," he said. "People do." Standing there in my driveway, I heard those words as clearly as if he were standing beside me. Funny how memories work. They stay quiet for years until one sentence wakes them up. I looked back at Vanessa. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Who told the board that bridge belongs to the HOA?" "Our legal committee reviewed the matter." "Did they review the county survey?" Her smile never disappeared, but it became just a little tighter around the edges. "We've confirmed everything necessary." It sounded like an answer. It wasn't. I tried again. "Did anyone contact the county recorder?" "That won't be necessary." "Did anyone check the deed?" "The board has already reached its decision." Every response somehow avoided the question I was actually asking. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed one of the contractors glance toward the bridge before quickly looking down at his boots. Another shifted his coffee from one hand to the other and studied the excavator instead. They looked uncomfortable. Not guilty exactly. More like men hoping someone else had already done the homework. I folded my arms. "I'd like to see whatever documents your committee relied on." Vanessa rested her clipboard against her hip. "Mr. Harper, all of that has already been handled." There it was again. Not evidence. Not records. Just confidence. Looking back now, that should have bothered me more than it did. People who have the facts usually don't mind showing them. People who keep repeating that everything has already been handled usually don't have much else to offer. Vanessa thanked me for my time as if we'd just finished discussing landscaping. Then she climbed into her SUV. One by one, the trucks rolled down my gravel driveway, leaving a cloud of pale dust hanging in the morning air. I stood there listening until the engines disappeared beyond the trees. The ranch became quiet again. Really quiet. The only sound was the river moving beneath the bridge and the wind pushing gently through the cottonwoods. Everything looked exactly the way it had an hour earlier. That's the strange thing about disasters. They almost never announce themselves. Most of the time, they arrive looking like an ordinary day. 2 days later, I came home expecting to drive across that bridge on my way to the house. Instead, I found the river open from one bank to the other, and the bridge my father built had completely disappeared. I knew something was wrong before I even reached the river. The ranch road curves gently through a stand of cottonwoods, and from that bend you can usually see the top rail of the bridge catching the sunlight. I've driven that road thousands of times. You stop noticing the bridge after a while because it's always there. That afternoon, it wasn't. At first, I blamed the trees, then the curve in the road. I remember leaning forward over the steering wheel like that would somehow change the view. It didn't. Another few seconds, and my stomach dropped. There was nothing spanning the river anymore. I hit the brakes so hard the truck slid sideways on the gravel before coming to a stop. I don't even remember shutting off the engine. I just climbed out and started walking. Slowly at first, then faster. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I kept telling myself there had to be another explanation. Maybe they'd closed the bridge. Maybe heavy equipment was parked on it. Maybe something. Bridges don't simply disappear between breakfast and dinner. But as I got closer, reality became impossible to ignore. The river stretched from bank to bank without anything crossing it. Fresh concrete had been ripped apart, leaving jagged chunks clinging to both sides like broken teeth. Twisted sections of steel railing lay half buried in the mud below. Deep excavator tracks scarred the riverbank, still sharp enough that rain hadn't had a chance to soften them yet. The smell hit me before anything else. Wet earth, freshly broken concrete, diesel fuel lingering in the warm afternoon air. It smelled like a construction site, except nobody was building anything. They'd come here to erase it. I walked to the edge of the bank without saying a word. The water flowed beneath the empty gap exactly as it always had, completely indifferent to what had happened above it. That's something I've noticed about rivers. They don't stop moving just because your world does. Near the shoreline, I spotted a twisted strip of yellow-painted steel sticking out of the mud. I climbed down, picked it up, and turned it over in my hands. Even bent nearly in half, I recognized it immediately. It had come from the center guardrail. Dad painted that yellow stripe himself after an early snowstorm years ago. One of our neighbors had nearly driven off the bridge in the dark while hauling horses home. The following weekend, Dad spent the entire Saturday painting that rail. I remember teasing him that nobody would notice the difference. He just smiled and said, "The people who don't end up in the river will." I stood there holding that twisted piece of steel a little longer than I probably should have. Funny what your mind grabs onto. Out of an entire bridge, I found myself mourning a strip of yellow paint. "Daniel." I looked up and saw Eric jogging toward me from the equipment shed. I'd known Eric for nearly 20 years. Usually I could tell what kind of day he'd had before he said a single word. I'd never seen him look like this. "I tried calling you all afternoon," he said, trying to catch his breath. "Your phone kept going straight to voicemail." I pulled it out of my pocket. "Dead battery." "Figures. Tell me what happened." Eric looked toward the empty river before answering. "They showed up around 10. "Vanessa?" He nodded. "Her. And the same contractors you saw the other day." He paused for a second. "This time they brought the excavator down to the bridge. Did anybody stop them?" I tried. He rubbed the back of his neck, clearly replaying the morning in his head. "She handed me this folder. Said the association had already completed its legal review. Told me everything had been approved. Did you read it?" He shook his head. "She wouldn't let me keep it. Just held it open long enough for me to see official-looking papers inside. Stamps. Signatures. I don't know what they were." He let out a frustrated breath. "The contractor kept saying they couldn't start until ownership had been verified. Vanessa told him it already had been." I looked back at the river. "How long?" "About 3 hours." 3 hours. That's all it took. I remembered standing beside my father for months while that bridge went up one section at a time. We poured concrete before sunrise because summer afternoons got too hot. We waited nearly a week for inspection after the footings were finished. Every step took patience. Every delay had a reason. Building something right is slow. Destroying it isn't. We stood there listening to the river for a while. Neither of us had much to say. On the opposite bank, several cattle had gathered near the crossing, almost as if they were waiting for someone to put it back. They'd used that bridge their entire lives. They didn't understand why the path had suddenly ended. Neither did I. Without the bridge, half the ranch might as well have been on another continent. Feed trucks would have to drive miles around on county roads. Equipment couldn't move between pastures. During fire season, every extra minute mattered. The bridge had never been a convenience. It was part of how the ranch worked. A few minutes later, another vehicle rolled slowly into the driveway. Black SUV, clean enough to reflect the afternoon sun. Vanessa stepped out carrying a large white envelope as though she were delivering holiday cards instead of standing beside the remains of someone else's property. "Mr. Harper," she said pleasantly, "I wanted to make sure you received this personally." She handed me the envelope. Inside was an invoice. Demolition services. Property compliance enforcement. Total due, $38,462.17. Payment due within 30 days. I actually laughed. Not because it was funny. Sometimes your brain just refuses to process something that absurd. "You're billing me?" I asked. "The association had to complete work you failed to perform," she replied. "Those costs are now your responsibility." I looked from the invoice back to the empty river. "One last question." "Certainly. Did anyone actually verify who owned that bridge?" She sighed very softly, almost like she was tired of explaining something obvious. "Mr. Harper, that issue has already been resolved." Then she turned around, climbed back into her SUV, and drove away. Same as before. No documents. No explanation. Just certainty. I folded the invoice once and slipped it into my pocket. Eric looked at me. "What now?" I didn't answer right away. Instead, I found myself thinking about the old gray filing cabinet sitting in my father's workshop. Every permit, every survey, every inspection, every receipt. I used to joke that he kept paper for things nobody would ever question. Standing there beside an empty river, I realized he hadn't been preparing for people who asked questions. He'd been preparing for people who never bothered to. By sunset, I was standing in front of that filing cabinet with the bottom drawer pulled open. My father's neat handwriting covered dozens of folders. Irrigation, north pasture, equipment, livestock. Then my eyes landed on one label that instantly made my pulse quicken. River crossing. I pulled it out. The folder was so thick the string wrapped around it had cut grooves into the cardboard. Whatever my father had saved, he hadn't left much out. I carried the folder into my father's workshop before I opened it. I don't know why. Maybe because it felt wrong to stand beside the river, surrounded by broken concrete and twisted steel, digging through papers he'd spent years protecting. Somehow, the workshop felt like the place where those documents belonged. The room hadn't changed much since he passed away. His old workbench still sat beneath the window, worn smooth around the edges from decades of use. A faded calendar hung on the wall 3 years out of date. His reading glasses rested exactly where he'd left them beside a coffee mug with a chipped handle. The place still smelled the same too. Sawdust, motor oil, old, leather. For just a second, I had the strange feeling that if I turned around quickly enough, I'd catch him walking through the back door asking why I looked so worried. Instead, there was only silence. I laid the folder on the workbench and brushed away a thin layer of dust. The string wrapped around it had become stiff with age. When I untied it, the cardboard relaxed with a soft crackle, like it had been waiting years for someone to finally open it again. Right on top sat a large folded survey map with the county surveyor's seal stamped across the corner. I spread it across the bench as carefully as I could. It covered nearly the entire surface. Bright red property lines outlined Harper Ranch. Fence lines, creek beds, easements. Every boundary was marked with the kind of precision only surveyors seemed capable of appreciating. My eyes went straight to the river. There it was, the bridge, sitting entirely inside our property line, not touching HOA land, not crossing into common area, not even close. I leaned over the map another inch, almost hoping I'd missed something. I hadn't. If anything, the property line was farther away than I'd remembered. I couldn't help shaking my head. Well, I muttered to myself, that's pretty hard to misunderstand. The next packet contained the original engineering drawings. Heavy blue paper covered with measurements, elevations, and notes written in tiny lettering. Dad never understood half of those drawings, but he insisted on keeping every page anyway. Tucked behind them was the construction permit issued by the county, complete with approval stamps and signatures. Then came inspection reports. Foundation inspection, steel inspection, final inspection. Every stage had been signed off before the next one began. Dad had never skipped a step. That sounded exactly like him. I smiled without realizing it. Growing up, I'd always thought he was overly cautious. If a project required 2 inspections, he'd ask for 3. If someone suggested 1 copy of a document, He'd make two and file both. At the time, it drove me crazy. Looking back, maybe experience had simply taught him something I hadn't learned yet. Deeper inside the folder, I found a document I'd never seen before. It was a recorded easement agreement between Harper Ranch and the county. I read the first paragraph once, then again more slowly. During floods, wildfires, or medical emergencies, county emergency vehicles were authorized to use our bridge because it provided the quickest access to several neighboring properties. I actually laughed under my breath. Not because it was funny, because it was unbelievable. Vanessa hadn't just demolished a privately owned bridge. She'd demolished a crossing the county had officially incorporated into its emergency response plans years before the subdivision even existed. I sat down on Dad's old stool and rubbed the back of my neck. "You really did keep everything," I whispered, as if he somehow knew this day was coming. Then I found the photographs. They were tucked inside a plain envelope labeled Final Inspection in Dad's careful handwriting. Most of the pictures showed construction crews pouring concrete, setting steel beams, and tightening bolts. Then one photograph made me stop turning pages. Emily. She stood in the middle of the completed bridge wearing her favorite denim jacket, laughing at something just outside the frame. The evening sun lit the river behind her, turning the water almost gold. I remembered that day immediately. Dad had insisted everyone stop working long enough to take pictures. Emily teased him, asking why anyone needed family portraits on a bridge. He'd grinned and said, "Because people only remember how things end. Somebody ought to remember how they begin." She rolled her eyes. I took the picture anyway. Funny thing is, he wasn't looking at the camera. He was looking at the bridge, like he was proud of it. I ran my thumb gently across the edge of the photograph before slipping it back into the envelope. For a moment, I forgot all about lawsuits. I just missed them both. The workshop felt awfully quiet after that. Outside, the wind stirred the cottonwoods along the river, and somewhere in the distance I heard cattle calling across the pasture. Life on the ranch kept moving, even if mine felt like it had stopped. Eventually, I reached for my phone. There was only one person I trusted to make sense of everything spread across that workbench. Laura Bennett had helped settle a boundary dispute for one of my neighbors a couple of years earlier. Around here, people said if Laura couldn't explain a property case, it probably couldn't be explained. She answered before the second ring finished. "Laura Bennett." "Laura, this is Daniel Harper." "Daniel, everything okay?" I looked down at the survey still covering my father's workbench. "Not exactly." There was a pause. "Tell me what happened." I started with Vanessa showing up in my driveway, then the excavator, then coming home to find the bridge gone. I told her about the invoice, the folder, the survey, the easement. She never interrupted once. When I finished, she asked only one question. "Are you at the ranch?" "Yes." "Don't move. I'll be there in an hour." She pulled into the yard just before sunset. Instead of walking toward the workshop, she stopped at the river first. We stood side by side looking across the empty gap where the bridge had been. She didn't say anything for almost a minute. Finally, she spoke. "That's a much bigger structure than I imagined." "It was." She nodded once. "Let's look at your paperwork." Back inside the workshop, she settled into Dad's old chair and began reading. She moved slowly, turning every page with the patience of someone who understood that details matter. Every so often she'd stop, underline a sentence with her finger, then continue. Nearly 40 minutes passed without either of us saying much. Finally, she closed the folder and rested both hands on top of it. "Daniel," she said quietly, "I expected to find one or two documents that might help us." And she gave a small smile I hadn't seen all day. "Instead, your father left us an entire courtroom." She tapped the survey, then the deed, then the easement, then the permits, then the inspection reports. Ownership is documented. Construction is documented. County approval is documented. Emergency access is documented. She looked me straight in the eye. "Do you know what I think happened?" I shook my head. Laura leaned back in the chair and let out a slow breath. "I don't think your bridge was demolished because the HOA proved it belonged to them." She rested one hand on the thick folder. "I think they demolished it because nobody ever bothered to read what was already sitting in the county records." Laura didn't file the lawsuit the next morning. If you'd asked me back then, I probably would have wanted her to. I was angry, the bridge was gone, and the evidence sitting on my father's workbench seemed overwhelming. In my mind, we already had everything we needed. Laura saw it differently. She closed the last folder, stacked every document into a neat pile, and looked across the table at me. We're going to wait. I frowned. Wait for what? For them to finish making every mistake they're going to make. That wasn't the answer I expected. She could tell from my face. Daniel, she said, right now you have proof that the bridge belonged to you. That's good. But I don't just want to prove ownership. She tapped the demolition invoice Vanessa had handed me. I want to prove they never cared who owned it in the first place. Looking back, that was the first time I realized lawsuits aren't won simply because you're right. They're won because you can prove exactly how the other side became wrong. Over the next several days, Laura's office became busier than my ranch. Every morning she'd call asking for another document my father had tucked away somewhere. Every afternoon she'd call again after comparing it against county records. The remarkable part wasn't finding new information. It was discovering that every single document in Dad's filing cabinet matched the county's records perfectly. Same legal descriptions, same survey markers, same engineering permits, same signatures. Not one discrepancy. Dad had somehow managed to build a bridge that was documented better than most commercial buildings. Laura laughed the third time she visited the workshop. Your father would have made an excellent real estate attorney. He hated lawyers, I reminded her. Exactly, she smiled. That's probably why he organized everything so well. A few days later, she asked me to drive into the county records office with her. The clerk behind the counter was an older gentleman named Harold. He adjusted his reading glasses, typed my property information into his computer, then disappeared into the archive room. When he returned, he carried a thick binder almost identical to the one sitting in my truck. Harper Ranch Bridge, he said before anyone asked a question. I remember this project. Laura raised an eyebrow. You do? Harold nodded. Your father insisted every revision be recorded properly. He smiled to himself. Most people complain about paperwork. He kept asking if there was any paperwork he'd forgotten. Even Harold seemed amused by the memory. He opened the county file and pointed to several familiar documents. The same survey, the same permits, the same inspection reports. Then he flipped to something I hadn't seen before. It was an internal county memorandum issued years earlier after a wildfire threatened several ranches west of town. Across the top, in bold letters, it identified one emergency crossing by name. Harper Ranch Bridge. Laura didn't say anything, but I noticed her quietly making a copy before we left. On the drive back, she finally spoke. That memo changes more than people realize. How? Because it proves the county wasn't just aware of your bridge. She looked over at me. They relied on it. That sentence stayed with me the rest of the day. Demolishing private property was already serious. Demolishing infrastructure recognized by county emergency services was something else entirely. The following week, Laura tracked down the engineering company that had designed the bridge. To my surprise, one of the original project engineers was still working there. His name was Michael Sanders. He invited us into a conference room lined with framed blueprints and old project photographs. When Laura laid Dad's engineering drawings on the table, Michael smiled immediately. I haven't seen these in years. He adjusted the pages until everything lined up perfectly. These are ours. He pointed to the company seal stamped across the corner. Original design package. Laura asked the obvious question. Who hired your firm? Michael didn't even hesitate. Harper Ranch. Not the HOA. He looked genuinely confused. The HOA didn't even exist when we built that bridge. He disappeared into another office and returned carrying an old archive folder. Inside was the original contract signed by my father, along with payment records, inspection correspondence, and engineering certifications. Every page identified Harper Ranch as the owner. Before we left, Michael shook my hand. Your father built that bridge the right way. He glanced down at the photographs. It's a shame somebody tore it down before bothering to read any of this. By then, the picture was becoming almost absurd. Every person who had actually worked on the bridge knew exactly who owned it. The county knew. The engineers knew. The surveyors knew. My father certainly knew. The only people who apparently hadn't checked were the ones who ordered it demolished. Then Robert Gaines knocked on my front door, carrying something folded under his arm. Robert lived inside Willow Creek Ridge and had quietly watched the whole situation unfold from the beginning. He looked around before stepping inside. Thought you might want this. He handed me a copy of the HOA newsletter. Across the front page was a large photograph of the excavator tearing into my bridge. Beneath it, in bold print, was the headline. Board successfully removes unauthorized structure. There wasn't a single question mark anywhere on the page. No mention of ownership being disputed. No acknowledgement that records were still being reviewed. Just certainty. Laura read the article twice before placing it beside the demolition invoice. Interesting, she murmured. Very interesting. Robert reached into his jacket again. There's one more thing. This time he handed her a printed email he'd received anonymously from someone inside the HOA office. Laura read it silently, then handed it to me. The first message came from the demolition contractor. Please confirm ownership before we begin demolition. Our insurance carrier requires written authorization. Vanessa's reply was only one sentence long. Ownership has already been reviewed by the board. Proceed as scheduled. I read it again, then a third time. It wasn't just confidence anymore. It was a written instruction. Laura slipped the email into her folder with a slow smile that I'd started recognizing. It was the smile she wore every time another missing piece quietly fell into place. Daniel, she said as she closed the binder, this case is no longer about whether your bridge belonged to you. I looked at the growing stack of documents covering her desk. Then what's it about? She rested one hand on the contractor's email. Now it's about something much simpler. She paused just long enough to let the words settle. Whether people are willing to swear, under oath, that they actually believed what they wrote. Discovery turned out to be nothing like television. Nobody burst into conference rooms waving smoking gun evidence. Nobody confessed under pressure. Most of it happened one cardboard box at a time. Weeks after filing the lawsuit, Laura called me into her office. Every available surface had disappeared beneath stacks of documents. Bankers' boxes lined one wall. 3 more sat unopened near the window. Legal pads covered with handwritten notes were scattered between binders thick enough to stop a door. I looked around and laughed. Either we're winning, or you've completely run out of storage. Laura smiled without looking up from the page she was reading. Both can be true. She slid another box toward herself and carefully removed a stack of HOA board minutes. This is what discovery looks like. I'd imagined we'd uncover one dramatic piece of evidence that settled everything. Instead, we received thousands of pages. Emails, meeting minutes, contractor invoices, financial records, internal memos, committee reports, insurance correspondence. Most of it had absolutely nothing to do with my bridge. Holiday decoration complaints, parking violations, landscaping contracts, arguments over mailbox colors. I picked up one folder and flipped through 3 pages debating whether homeowners should be allowed blue flower pots on front porches. People actually spent time discussing this. Laura didn't even smile. Keep reading long enough and you'll discover people document the strangest things. Day after day, she worked through the boxes with almost unbelievable patience. Sometimes she'd spend an hour reading documents that led nowhere. Other times she'd stop after 2 pages and quietly place a yellow sticky note on the corner before moving to the next file. She never rushed. She knew evidence usually hides inside ordinary paperwork because that's where people stop paying attention. One afternoon, I walked in carrying sandwiches from the diner down the road. Laura hadn't touched the coffee sitting beside her for so long it had gone cold. She wasn't reading anymore. She was staring at one particular email chain. Daniel, she said without taking her eyes off the page, come look at this. I stepped beside her desk. The email began several weeks before the demolition. The contractor assigned to remove the bridge had written to the HOA project coordinator. Before scheduling equipment, please provide documentation confirming ownership of the structure. Our insurer requires written verification before demolition begins. That sounded familiar. We've already seen a similar request. But this chain continued. Instead of attaching surveys or deeds, someone from the HOA office forwarded the email to Vanessa with a short note. Contractor is requesting ownership documentation again. Vanessa answered less than 10 minutes later. The board has already determined the bridge is ours. No additional verification is necessary. Proceed. Laura tapped the screen with her pen. Notice what's missing. I read it again. Then again. Finally it hit me. There isn't any documentation attached. Exactly. She opened another folder containing dozens of emails exchanged over the next 2 days. The contractor asked again. The insurance company requested confirmation. Even the project manager wondered whether a survey should be obtained before demolition. Every single request received essentially the same response. The board had already decided. Nobody actually answered the question being asked. They simply repeated the conclusion. Funny how certainty can sound convincing until someone asks where it came from. Laura leaned back in her chair. They weren't hiding documents. Because there weren't any? She nodded. I'm beginning to think they never performed an ownership analysis at all. That possibility somehow felt worse than if they'd simply misunderstood a survey. Mistakes happen. Choosing not to look? That's different. A few days later, another production request arrived from the HOA's attorneys. This time it included audio recordings of board meetings. Laura spent nearly an entire afternoon listening through headphones while making notes. I could only hear muffled voices from across the room. Every so often she'd pause the recording, rewind 30 seconds, then listen again. Finally, she waved me over. Listen. She pressed play. One board member asked whether someone should verify property ownership through county records before authorizing demolition. Another voice, I recognized Vanessa immediately, answered without hesitation. We've already spent enough time on this issue. If the bridge disappears, the ranch traffic problem disappears with it. The room fell silent for several seconds before someone quietly moved on to the next agenda item. Laura stopped the recording. Neither of us spoke for a moment. She finally broke the silence. Did you hear what wasn't said? I frowned. What do you mean? Nobody answered the ownership question. She tapped her notebook. They answered the inconvenience question. I hadn't thought about it that way before. To them, the bridge wasn't a piece of private property. It was simply something they wanted gone. Ownership had become an obstacle instead of a fact worth confirming. Later that week, we returned to the county records office to verify one final detail. Harold, the same clerk who'd helped us before, smiled as soon as he saw the bridge file again. Back already? Laura asked him a simple question. How difficult would have been to verify ownership before demolition? Harold actually laughed. He turned his computer monitor toward us, entered the parcel number, and within less than a minute displayed the recorded deed, survey, easement, and permit history. About 45 seconds, he said. Then he paused and shrugged. Maybe another 15 if someone wanted printed copies. I couldn't help shaking my head. Months of lawsuits. Hundreds of, thousands of dollars in legal fees. A destroyed bridge. All because nobody had spent 1 minute checking public records that had been sitting there for years. Before we left, Harold said something that stayed with me. Your father came in here all the time. He smiled at the memory. Every time he built something, he'd ask me the same question. What was that? Harold adjusted his glasses. Is there anything else I should file so nobody has to guess 50 years from now? I looked out the courthouse window for a second before answering. Sounds like him. Back at Laura's office, she organized every important document into trial binders. Survey first. Deed second. Easement third. Engineering records. Inspection reports. Emails. Audio transcripts. Meeting minutes. Everything flowed in chronological order until the story almost told itself. Then she received one final order from the judge. Because several discovery requests had produced incomplete responses, the HOA was required to turn over every remaining internal communication relating to the bridge. Laura placed the order carefully into the front pocket of her binder before closing it. People always worry about the documents they've already produced, she said. The interesting ones. She rested her hand on the unopened box that had arrived that morning. Are usually the documents they hoped nobody would ever have to read. By the time depositions began, nearly 6 months had passed since the bridge disappeared. The river had settled back into its usual rhythm. Grass had started growing over the excavator tracks. If someone drove past the ranch for the first time, they might never have guessed a bridge had ever stood there. That's the strange thing about time. It softens the landscape long before it softens the people living through it. Laura warned me that depositions wouldn't feel dramatic. Think of them as conversations people can't take back, she said. Nobody's trying to win. They're trying to explain themselves. That's usually when the truth starts slipping through. The first deposition belonged to the demolition contractor. We gathered in a conference room downtown with a court reporter, seated quietly in one corner. The contractor looked uncomfortable from the moment he sat down. He wasn't hostile. If anything, he seemed relieved someone was finally asking him what had happened. Laura kept her voice calm. Before your company began demolition, what steps did you take to verify ownership of the bridge? He folded his hands together. We asked the HOA for documentation. Did you receive a deed? No. A certified survey? No. A title report? No. Laura nodded once. Then why proceed? He let out a slow breath. Because the HOA informed us ownership had already been verified by its legal committee. She slid one document across the table. Did anyone from your company independently contact the county? No. Hire a surveyor? No. Search public property records? No. Another pause. Why not? He looked down at the tabletop before answering. We relied on the HOA's written authorization. There wasn't any anger in his voice, just honesty. By the end of the deposition, one thing had become painfully clear. The contractor hadn't destroyed my bridge because he knew who owned it. He destroyed it because he assumed someone else had already done that work. A few days later, we met with Michael Sanders, the engineer whose firm had designed the bridge years earlier. Unlike the contractor, Michael walked into the room carrying 2 thick binders and a tube containing the original engineering drawings. He laid everything neatly across the table before anyone asked a question. Laura smiled. Looks like you came prepared. Michael shrugged. Engineers usually do. That answer sounded exactly like something my father would have appreciated. Laura asked him to explain the normal process before any permanent structure is demolished. Michael spoke with the kind of quiet precision you only hear from people who've spent decades solving practical problems. Ownership verification comes first, he said. Always. Why? Because engineering tells you how to remove a structure safely. He rested one hand on the drawings. Property records tell you whether you have the legal right to remove it at all. He then walked everyone through the bridge design page by page. Load calculations, foundation depth, flood resistance, inspection certifications. Every answer led back to the same conclusion. The bridge had been professionally designed, lawfully permitted, properly inspected, and constructed exactly where it was intended to stand. Before leaving, Laura asked one final question. Based on your experience, had someone spent 1 hour reviewing the engineering file and county records, would there have been any confusion regarding ownership? Michael didn't hesitate. None. The following week brought perhaps the most important witness of all. Rebecca Collins, the licensed surveyor, arrived carrying field notebooks worn smooth from years of use. She had recently visited the ranch herself after Laura hired her to perform a new boundary survey. Rebecca spread several large aerial maps across the conference table before pointing to a series of small red markings. These are the original survey monuments placed before the subdivision was ever developed. She looked toward the opposing attorneys. Every one of them remains intact. Laura asked, "Did you find any evidence that the bridge crossed onto HOA property?" Rebecca shook her head. No. She traced one property line with her finger. The nearest HOA boundary is several dozen feet away. Could reasonable professionals disagree about that? Not after conducting a survey. She smiled politely. Property lines aren't opinions. I like that sentence more than I probably should have. Property lines aren't opinions. Simple, clear, impossible to argue with. Laura asked one last question. Approximately how long would have been required to confirm bridge ownership using public records and an existing survey? Rebecca thought for a second. Less than an hour. There it was again. Another professional. Another independent expert. Another person arriving at exactly the same answer. Nobody needed months of litigation. Nobody needed expensive consultants. They simply needed someone willing to look. A few days after Rebecca's deposition, another box of documents arrived from the HOA under the judge's supplemental discovery order. Laura called me before I'd even finished feeding cattle. That morning, "I've got something you need to see." When I reached her office, she'd already separated one email thread from the rest. It was exchanged the afternoon before demolition. One board member wrote, "Should we ask the county to verify ownership before equipment arrives tomorrow?" Vanessa answered 12 minutes later. "We've spent enough time chasing paperwork. We know where the bridge is. That's enough." Laura handed me the page without saying anything. I read it twice. Then I set it back on her desk. "She actually wrote that?" Laura nodded. "Yes." She knew someone was asking for verification. "Yes." And she refused. Laura folded the email into the evidence binder. "That's an important distinction." I looked at her. "Between what?" She rested her hand gently on the stack of documents we'd spent months collecting. "Between making a mistake." She paused for just a moment. "And making a decision not to find out whether you're mistaken." The room fell quiet after that. Outside her office window, Traffic moved through town like any ordinary afternoon. People headed home from work. Kids rode bicycles down the sidewalk. Life carried on. But sitting there with that single email in front of me, I realized the trial ahead wasn't going to revolve around engineering, surveys, or even property law anymore. It was going to revolve around one simple question. How many opportunities can someone ignore before certainty stops being an excuse and starts becoming a choice? The trial began on a Monday morning under a gray October sky. I pulled into the courthouse parking lot earlier than I needed to. Old habit, I guess. My father always believed being early gave you time to think before everyone else started talking. I sat in the truck for a minute with both hands resting on the steering wheel. Across the street, the diner was filling with regulars ordering breakfast. A delivery truck rattled past the courthouse steps. It looked like any other morning. If someone had told those people eating pancakes that a case about one ranch bridge was about to cost an HOA nearly $2 million, they probably would have laughed. I might have too, months earlier. Laura met me at the courthouse entrance carrying the same worn leather briefcase she'd carried through every deposition. "Sleep at all?" she asked. "Some." She smiled knowingly. That's usually what everyone says. Inside the courtroom, everything felt smaller than I remembered. Maybe television had distorted my expectations. There were no rows of spectators filling the benches. Just a handful of local reporters, several homeowners from Willow Creek Ridge, a few county employees curious about the case, and people waiting for hearings in other courtrooms who wandered in after reading the docket outside. Robert sat quietly near the back and gave me a small nod when our eyes met. Across the aisle, Vanessa was already seated beside the HOA's attorney. She looked exactly the way she had the morning she stood in my driveway. Perfectly pressed suit, neatly organized binder, calm expression, but something had changed. Months ago she looked certain. This morning she looked determined. There's a difference. Certainty doesn't expect to be challenged. Determination already knows it has been. Once everyone settled in, the judge entered, and the room rose together. After a few preliminary matters, Laura stood to deliver our opening statement. She didn't pace. She didn't raise her voice. She simply walked to the center of the courtroom carrying one slim binder instead of the mountain of documents we'd collected over the previous 6 months. I remember wondering why she'd left everything else behind. Then she began. "Your Honor," she said, "this case is not about a complicated property dispute." She paused just long enough for the courtroom to become completely still. "It is about what happens when people stop asking a simple question before destroying someone else's property." She held up the certified survey. "Who owns it?" Then came the deed. The answer was here. The recorded easement. Here. The county permits. Here. The engineering file. Here. She never rushed. Every document landed on the evidence table like another stone being added to the same foundation. The defendants had access to every one of these records before demolition began. They chose not to review them. Then, she sat down. Less than 10 minutes. That was all. Somehow she'd condensed thousands of pages into a story so simple even someone who'd never seen a property map could follow it. The HOA's attorney approached next. To his credit, he didn't attack me or question whether the bridge belonged to Harper Ranch. Instead, he framed everything as an unfortunate misunderstanding. The board acted in good faith based on information available at the time, he told the court. They believed they were protecting association property. It wasn't a bad argument. If I hadn't lived through everything that followed, I might even have believed it. But I glanced toward Laura. She didn't look worried. She simply wrote 2 words on her legal pad. Good faith. Then she underlined them once. The witnesses came one after another. Harold from the county records office explained how ownership information could be located in less than a minute. Michael Sanders walked through the engineering drawings and confirmed Harper Ranch had commissioned every stage of the project. Rebecca Collins displayed the survey markers and explained that the bridge sat entirely inside our property boundaries. Each witness used different words, different experiences, different professions, yet somehow they all reached exactly the same conclusion. Ownership had never been difficult to determine. It had only been ignored. Then it was Vanessa's turn. She walked confidently to the witness stand, took the oath, and settled into the chair. At first, she answered every question with the same steady composure she'd shown since this whole thing began. Yes, the board believed the bridge belonged to the HOA. Yes, the demolition had been approved unanimously. Yes, she believed she had acted responsibly. Laura didn't interrupt. She let Vanessa finish every answer completely before asking the next question. Did you personally review the certified survey before approving demolition? No. Did you obtain a title search? No. Did you contact the county recorder? No. Did you hire a licensed surveyor? No. The courtroom became noticeably quieter after each answer. Laura reached for another exhibit. Did members of your own board ask whether ownership should be verified before demolition? Vanessa hesitated for the first time all morning. Yes. Laura displayed the email on the courtroom monitors. And this is your response. Vanessa looked at the screen for several seconds before answering. Yes. Laura read it aloud. We've spent enough time chasing paperwork. We know where the bridge is. That's enough. Nobody moved. Even the court reporter seemed to pause for half a heartbeat before continuing to type. Laura stepped a little closer to the witness stand. Her voice never changed. Mrs. Whitmore, if someone had spent less than 1 hour reviewing public records before demolition, would Mr. Harper's bridge still be standing today? Vanessa looked toward her attorney, then toward the judge, finally back at Laura. When she answered, her voice was quieter than it had been all week. Yes. It wasn't dramatic. There were no raised voices, no objections, no theatrical confession, just one word. But that single word quietly connected every survey, every permit, every email, every deposition, and every decision we'd spent months assembling. Laura thanked the witness and returned to counsel table. I glanced around the courtroom. The homeowners sitting behind Vanessa no longer looked confused. They looked disappointed. Robert slowly lowered his eyes to the floor. Across the room, even the HOA's attorney seemed to know the case had shifted. For months, everyone had argued about paperwork. That morning, the paperwork stopped being the story. It became proof of something much simpler. The bridge hadn't disappeared because ownership was uncertain. It disappeared because certainty had replaced verification. And for the first time since Vanessa pulled into my driveway with that excavator behind her, I had the unmistakable feeling that the truth no longer needed anyone to defend it. It could finally stand on its own. Court resumed the following morning, but the atmosphere had changed. During the first few days, every witness had brought another piece of the puzzle into the room. Every document had answered one question while raising another. Now there weren't many questions left. The evidence had stopped pointing in different directions. It was all pointing to the same place. I noticed it before anyone said a word. The reporters who'd been whispering in the back of the courtroom grew quiet as soon as the judge walked in. Even the homeowners sitting behind Vanessa seemed less interested in taking notes than simply hearing how it would all end. Laura leaned over before proceedings began. Listen carefully, she whispered. Closing arguments aren't about repeating evidence. She closed her trial binder with one hand. They're about reminding the court what the evidence has already proven. Then she stood. She walked to the podium carrying only a thin folder. After months of gathering documents, interviewing witnesses, reviewing surveys, and listening to depositions, she'd reduced the entire case to less than 20 pages. That alone told me she was ready. Your Honor, she began, this case has never depended on whether the bridge belonged to Mr. Harper. She held up the certified survey. Because every witness who mattered has already answered that question. She placed it on the evidence table, then the deed, then the recorded easement, then the engineering certification. Finally, she laid the email containing Vanessa's instruction beside the rest. 5 documents. 5 quiet movements. No theatrics. The defendants have suggested they acted in good faith. Laura paused for a moment before continuing. Good faith is not measured by confidence. It is measured by effort. Nobody shifted in their seats. The courtroom had become so quiet I could hear the faint rustle of paper every time someone turned a page. Laura looked toward the judge. The contractor asked for ownership verification. She rested one finger on the first exhibit. The insurance carrier requested ownership verification. Another page. Members of the board suggested ownership verification. Another page. Public records were available. Another. Licensed professionals were available. She let the silence hang for just a second. Verification was offered repeatedly. Then she looked across the courtroom toward Vanessa. It was simply declined. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The words carried farther that way. Laura closed the folder and stepped away from the podium. Nobody is asking this court to punish an honest mistake. Honest mistakes happen every day. We're asking the court to recognize the difference between failing to know and choosing not to find out. She returned to counsel table without another sentence. I remember thinking that if someone had walked into the courtroom at that exact moment without hearing a single witness beforehand, they still would have understood the entire case. The HOA's attorney stood next. He acknowledged that the board should have conducted additional research before authorizing demolition. He admitted procedures could have been handled better, but he argued there had never been any malicious intent. The association believed it was acting within its authority, he said. The evidence shows poor judgment, not deliberate misconduct. It was probably the strongest argument he had left. But even while he spoke, I found myself looking toward the witness stand where Vanessa had testified the day before. One question kept echoing in my head. Would the bridge still be standing today? Her answer had been only one word. Yes. It was difficult to build another argument around that. Once both attorneys finished, the judge announced a short recess before issuing his decision. Everyone slowly filed into the hallway. Nobody talked much. Even the reporters seemed unusually quiet. Cases like this don't usually end with dramatic surprises. They end with people waiting. Laura stood beside one of the courthouse windows overlooking the square. She wasn't reading notes anymore. She wasn't rehearsing anything. She simply folded her arms and watched leaves blowing across the sidewalk below. "You seem awfully calm," I said. She smiled. "I've already heard the evidence." I laughed softly. "Fair point." After a moment, I asked the question that had been sitting in the back of my mind for weeks. "When did you know?" She looked at me without answering immediately. "Not when I found the survey. Not the permits." She shook her head. "Not even the easement." "Then when?" She looked down the hallway toward the courtroom. "Doors." "The email." I knew exactly which one she meant. "We've spent enough time chasing paperwork. We know where the bridge is." "That's enough." Laura nodded almost to herself. "People make mistakes all the time." She folded her hands together. "They usually don't write down the moment they choose to stop checking." Before I could answer, the bailiff opened the courtroom doors again. Court is back in session. Everyone quietly returned to their seats. The judge entered carrying several pages in front of him. They weren't handwritten notes. They were a prepared opinion. That caught my attention immediately. Judges don't usually spend that much time writing unless they intend every word to matter. He adjusted his glasses and began reading. His voice remained steady from the first sentence to the last. He reviewed the history of the bridge, the recorded deeds, the engineering records, the county permits, the easement, the testimony from Harold, Michael, and Rebecca. Then he turned to the HOA's internal communications. He noted that multiple opportunities to verify ownership had existed before demolition. He noted that those opportunities had not been taken. Finally, he reached the point everyone in the courtroom had been waiting for. "The court finds," he read, "that the defendants failed to exercise reasonable diligence before authorizing the destruction of privately owned property." I felt my hands tighten around the edge of the table without realizing it. The judge turned another page. "The evidence demonstrates that public records capable of resolving the ownership question were readily available before demolition commenced." He looked briefly toward both attorneys before continuing. "Those records were not reviewed." Across the aisle, Vanessa lowered her eyes to the documents in front of her. For the first time since I'd met her, she didn't appear confident. She looked like someone replaying a decision she'd finally realized could never be undone. The judge continued reading through the remaining findings. He hadn't reached the amount of damages yet. That would come next. But by then, everyone sitting in that courtroom already understood something far more important than a dollar figure. The trap hadn't closed because of one dramatic piece of evidence. It had closed because every ordinary document, every ordinary witness, and every ordinary question had quietly pointed to exactly the same truth until there was simply nowhere left to step around it. The judgment didn't rebuild the bridge. Court orders never do. They don't pour concrete. They don't set steel. They don't erase the sound an excavator makes when it's tearing apart something your family spent months creating. What they can do is something much quieter. They can make the truth permanent. A week after the ruling, I drove down to the river just after sunrise. Habit, I suppose. For months I'd avoided stopping there because every visit reminded me of what had been lost. That morning felt different. The broken concrete had been hauled away. Survey stakes stood neatly along both banks. Orange paint marked where new footings would go. The river flowed through the gap as calmly as it always had, as if none of us had spent the better part of a year fighting over the ground above it. Nature has a way of moving on before people are ready. I climbed out of the truck and stood there listening. Water against the rocks, wind moving through the cottonwoods. Somewhere behind me, a meadowlark started singing. It struck me that this was the first morning in months I wasn't thinking about the lawsuit. I was thinking about the bridge that would take its place. Construction began the following week. Watching the crews unload equipment brought back memories I hadn't expected. The smell of fresh-cut lumber, diesel engines idling before sunrise, the sharp ring of steel chains tightening around concrete forms. I'd seen it all before, standing beside my father years earlier with a tape measure in one hand and a thermos of coffee in the other. Before anyone touched the first beam, the superintendent gathered his entire crew around the hood of his pickup. He held up a thick binder and smiled when he noticed me watching. "Sorry," he called out. "Nobody starts work until everybody knows exactly where the property line is." A few workers laughed. One of them shook his head and said, "After hearing what happened here, I'd rather spend an extra hour reading paperwork than an extra year sitting in court." I laughed too. Dad would have appreciated that. Every survey marker was checked twice. Every permit was reviewed again. Every measurement was confirmed before concrete was poured. Nobody complained. Funny how paperwork never seems like wasted time after someone learns what skipping it can cost. The story spread farther than I ever imagined. First, the local newspaper picked it up. Then a regional television station ran a feature about the lawsuit. Before long, complete strangers were recognizing me at livestock auctions, farm supply stores, and county fairs. Most conversations started exactly the same way. "You're the rancher with the bridge, aren't you?" I'd smile and nod. Then came the question everyone seemed to ask. Why didn't they just check the records? I never gave a complicated answer. Because they confused confidence with proof. People usually nodded without another word. They understood. Robert kept me updated on everything happening inside Willow Creek Ridge. The first HOA meeting after the judgment lasted nearly 4 hours. According to him, nobody cared about landscaping rules or mailbox paint anymore. Homeowners arrived carrying copies of the court's opinion with highlighted sections sticking out between the pages. One resident reportedly held up the judgment and asked, "How did we spend $1.8 million without reading one county survey?" Nobody answered. Another homeowner asked why engineers weren't consulted. Someone else asked why the board ignored requests to verify ownership. Every question circled back to the same place. Not the bridge. Not the money. The decision to stop checking before all the facts were known. Robert told me the silence between questions felt longer than the questions themselves. Within a month, several board members resigned. Vanessa resigned shortly afterward. Robert heard she'd listed her house for sale before the end of the season. A few weeks later, she was gone. I never saw her again. To be honest, I never tried. There was a time when I imagined I'd feel satisfied seeing her. Apologize. Or embarrassed. Or forced to admit she was wrong. Somewhere along the way, that feeling disappeared. Carrying resentment takes energy. Ranch work already demands enough of that. The new HOA board made one decision that probably should have existed from the very beginning. Before taking enforcement action involving fences, retaining walls, docks, bridges, roads, or any permanent structure, the association would be required to obtain independent ownership verification through county records and, if necessary, a licensed surveyor. Simple rule. Simple process. Expensive lesson. By late autumn, the replacement bridge was finished. It stood a little wider than the old one, built to newer engineering standards, but from a distance it looked almost exactly the way Dad would have wanted. Before driving across, I shut off the engine and stepped out one last time. The afternoon sun reflected off the water below. Cattle grazed peacefully in the west pasture. A light breeze carried the smell of dry grass and river mud across the valley. I rested my hand on the new guardrail and smiled without realizing it. For years I'd teased my father about that old gray filing cabinet sitting in the corner of his workshop. I used to think the bridge was the greatest thing he'd ever built. Standing there, I finally understood I'd been wrong. Bridges are made of steel and concrete. Given enough time, both eventually wear out. Paper seems fragile by comparison. It tears. It fades. It yellows with age. But when it's honest, carefully kept, and backed by the truth, it can outlast steel. It can protect a family long after the people who filled out the forms are gone. As I eased the truck onto the new bridge, I heard my father's voice as clearly as I had the morning Vanessa first pulled into my driveway. Paper doesn't forget. People do. Back then, I thought he was talking about filing cabinets. Now I know he was talking about something much bigger. Property can be damaged. Buildings can be demolished. Even bridges can disappear in a single afternoon. But the truth, when someone takes the time to preserve it, has a remarkable way of finding its way back home.